the search party, Hamza. They were about to send out the search party. What happened? Oops. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us, despite probably... Hello? Hello? Good morning. Thank you for joining us this morning at, I think, what promises to be an exciting panel, even though the audience, well, for you at least. We're going to be discussing today the situation a decade after the Arab Spring and the politics that are coming. Basically, what we've seen over the past decade is that the political and economic challenges that triggered the Arab Spring to begin with have not only not been dealt with, but have gotten a lot worse than what they were a decade ago. Today, the region is facing a triple crisis: food security, a debt crisis, and I forgot the third one, and an energy crisis. Sorry. And an energy crisis. At the same time, we're seeing protests sweeping across the region in different countries. And these also, these conditions have obviously been amplified by the COVID-19, in addition to a lot of other factors. The fiscal space that many of these countries had initially to deal with the crisis in 2011 is simply no more there for most of these countries, especially in the Levant and in North Africa. And at the same time, demonstrations across the region flag the extent to which discontent is also increased tremendously, not least of which is in Iran over the past 3 months. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about what lies ahead for the region, for the protests. What is the political promise? Is there a political promise? Are we likely to see change? And if yes, what kind of change? With me on this panel today, and I'll go by the order that they're here, is Tariq Masoud, who's a professor of democracy and governance, the Ford Foundation professor of democracy and governance at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. Sarah Bazubandi, who's the Marie Curie Research Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies. My colleague Hamza Meddeb, who's a fellow and the director of the Political Economy Program in the Mena region at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. And Ranj Alauddin, who is a fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs and the director and Crisis Response Council. And last but not least, also my colleague, Hisham Hellier, who is the senior fellow at RUSI, the International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute, and also a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington. So let me begin with a question and I'll ask the same question for each of you, and I'd ask you just to give sort of very punctual remarks on this, which is 11 years after the Arab Spring. What remains of the 2011 uprising? How do you assess the situation today? And we'll be talking more details. Tariq, let me begin with you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Mahan. Thanks, everybody, for coming this morning. So what remains of the Arab Spring 11 years after it erupted? On one account, you could say very little. You know, if you measure the success and impact of the Arab Spring in terms of the amount of democracy that it brought to the region, today the region is far less democratic than it was even before the Arab Spring erupted. But I actually think there are deep legacies of the Arab Spring that we observe today. And there are really, the Arab world today is really dealing with two of these legacies. On the one hand, you do have, as you alluded to, these continuing movements for democracy and representative government and more accountable government. And that's represented in some of the protest movements that you talked about that we might get into later. And, you know, just these nascent desires that for a different political formula. The other legacy of the Arab Spring is really, so if that's about changing leaders, the other legacy is about sort of changing societies, and that's really from the top down. If the ruling formula in the Arab world before the Arab Spring was one of stability, management, and maintenance, today, Arab leaders, in part because of the experience of the Arab Spring, are recognizing that they do have to deliver some kind of change. And that's why we do see this kind of social, zeal for social reform that's intended to kind of modernize societies and modernize people. And you see this in the realm of women's rights, you see it in the realm of education, et cetera. And you see it in the realm of reforming religion. And while this is top down, and it's almost like you could say, the people want to change the leaders want to change the people. But I think this top-down movement for social reform is itself a legacy of the Arab Spring and may have some interesting medium and long-term impacts on the region's prospects for democracy.
Thank you, Tariq. Hamza, I'll be coming back to Iran, Sarah, but people want to change the leaders and leaders want to change the people. I like this. So.
This is the dilemma maybe 10 years after 2011, but I think there are maybe three major lessons or dynamics that we are witnessing in the region. There is clearly a surge of neo-authoritarian movement or neo-authoritarianism in the region. It started, of course, very early with the coup in Egypt in 2013, and then, of course, with civil wars in Libya, in Yemen, etc. And what we are witnessing even in Tunisia now, what was, I mean, Tunisia used to be at least the unique, maybe counterexample or experiment in the region, is now witnessing and living in a surge of new form of authoritarianism, in a way. So with this, I think, over the 10 years, there is clearly regimes adapted in a way. They have adapted to a new context. They have adapted even in technical ways. I mean, they were completely, I mean, not able to manage the social media in 2011. Today, they have, it seems like they have upgraded even their capacities to survey and for surveillance techniques and technologies to manipulate and to instrumentalize even the social media sphere. So this is one thing. The second, I think, is that the region is living in a sort of post-ideological moment. There is a vacuum of ideology. The failure of political Islam, failure of authoritarian, old-style authoritarian regimes, etc. But we are still looking for alternatives. So there is an ideological vacuum, actually. What would be this new ideology, this new political offer that can eventually mobilize people? The third, maybe, outcome is a sort of fragmentation of the protest landscape. We'll be talking certainly about protest movements, etc. But it seems to me like, I mean, Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, they have all witnessed, even now Iran, of course, Algeria with Al-Harak, they have witnessed actually a sort of really strong dynamic of protest movements, but this dynamic has been fragmented. It haven't converged into to offer a sort of alternative, and the fragmentation is still actually. So we have farmers, unemployed people, and different social groups, and mobilizing, but without really offering a sort of serious alternative. Now, I think the positive, to end with a positive note, I think political Islam failed, but dictatorships failed miserably, I think. And the situation now in Egypt, or even in Tunisia, almost 2 years after the coup in July 2021, shows that really, I think there is no sustainable alternative to democratization. It takes time. It needs to get sort of maturity. And I think this is one of the lessons, that we cannot build democracy overnight.
We will come back to this because this is hopefully will be the positive ending note of this session. But Ranj, let me move to you. Post-ideological moment in a country like Iraq, where we've seen massive demonstrations, but also no alternative.
Well, thanks very much, Maha. I mean, Iraq doesn't lack ideologies. So I don't think Iraq is quite at that stage just yet. But look, I mean, I would say Iraq doesn't have many positives, but potentially glimmers of hope that I'll touch on a bit later on.
Yes.
It's a country that is, I think, in a more different, to put it lightly, situation compared to others in the region. It's still trying to wean itself off or recover from the legacy of the 2003 invasion, still trying to recover from the legacy of the former regime. And so in that sense, it's still a post-conflict transitioning society. Now that has a number of implications for the
In a
country.
sectarian context, sectarian power sharing context.
Sectarian power sharing context, the legacy of ISIS. And so as a post-conflict transitioning society, there are a number of implications. A weak state, sounds very familiar. The proliferation or the ascension of armed non-state actors. 3, a ruling elite that has managed to survive against all odds, saved most recently by the increase in oil prices. And 4th, a domestic context that sees a growing youth population. 60% of the Iraqi population is under 25. It's a population that will reach 50 million in 10 years. 700,000 Iraqis need jobs every year. But of course, you've got a weak state that can't absorb that number of Iraqis, that can't heed that particular demand. So as I say, if it wasn't for the increase in oil prices, Iraq would have undergone a socio-economic implosion. Now, speaking of legacies, and here's where perhaps you've got a combination of a glimmer of hope, but at the same time, cause for concern. 2018, Iraq, I would argue personally, had its so-called Arab Spring moment with the emergence of a protest movement comprised of disparate factions, a combination, well, mostly young, but with some support from more established structures, parties, clerics, and so on and so forth. That period was an inflection point for Iraq because we saw the full weight of the state against reform, essentially. So 700 plus Iraqis were killed, thousands were wounded by mostly state-sanctioned militia forces. And I think that's where perhaps things get a bit more tricky with Iraq, because not only is it trying to wean itself off American influence, but it's also increasingly becoming, once again, a battleground for proxy conflict. And in that context, the glimmer of hope is perhaps the revival of Iraq's relationship with the Arab world. Personally, I would argue that recent events in Iraq during the government formation process and the escalation could have led to a proxy conflict were it not for the outreach, the efforts, the initiatives, the diplomatic acumen of the former Prime Minister Kadhimi, who put all his efforts pretty much into developing relations with Saudi Arabia, with the Arab world, with the GCC, but at the same time trying to transform Iraq into an actor that can mediate tensions in the region. So there are some hopes there geopolitically. Domestically, there's an expansive reform agenda in the north, in the south, which I'll touch on a bit later on.
We will come back to this and get more into the weeds on Iraq. But obviously, I mean, for me, what is emerging also is that it's not one story across the region when we talk about the legacy of the Arab Spring. Hisham, post-ideological, youth.
Well, first, thank you, Maha.
Bargaining.
Thank you, Maha, for hosting and chairing this panel, and for ISMI and the ministry for arranging it. So I'm glad that you mentioned the word youth, because actually I wanted to talk about the demographic challenges within the region. But first, a very quick snapshot of where we were and where we are. Maybe at the beginning of the Arab Spring, people would have talked about things like sectarianism, they would have talked about polarization, they might have talked about demographics, and they might have spoken about energy needs. All of these things are not only still in play, they've actually become far more exacerbated, they're far more serious. So, we just had COP27, we're going to have COP28. The issues around all of these environmental factors are becoming much more stark. And when it comes to the demographic question, you'll have several countries in the region where more than 70% of the population is under the age of 30. And that's a big challenge. You know, a country like Egypt, the average age is 23 and it's dropping. Whereas it was 26 only about a decade or so ago. But we're really seeing quite an intense move in this regard. And this represents quite a challenge for the best of governments with the best of capacity, okay? And they don't have the best of capacity at all. There are two challenges here. One, that the younger population is going to want to see opportunities, and if they don't see them, then there's going to be some sort of upheaval, whether low level or mid-simmering or whatever. But that's something that has to be taken into account. The other is that the overall or overarching domestic security architecture of many of these countries is we provide a social contract. As long as we're able to maintain security and we're able to hold things together, then things are going to be fine. Especially because they know that there are limits, they know the restrictions, so these populations aren't going to push back too hard. When these populations are that young, they don't actually remember things of the past, okay? We're in 2022, I would say very few people have really first-hand experiences within particularly North Africa of what happened in 2011. They would have heard about it, but they would be too young to really have experienced it, which means that it doesn't have the same impact on them as it does in another way on people who are much older than them. So that's something that I think is important. When you talk about post-ideational, post-ideological, that brings us to another point which I think is relevant for the discussion, which is the development of regional geopolitics. And I don't mean geopolitics in the sense of connections with the outside, with Russia and China and the United States. This is a very important issue, but it's not what I'm referring to. I'm talking about geopolitics of the region, the different alignments that have been shifting and moving, and of course they keep on shifting and moving. We just saw President Erdogan shake hands with President Sisi last week, so there's normalization efforts taking place there. But you also have these, I won't say quite set, but different axes and poles of influence within the region, and they sometimes erupt, and they do actually manifest themselves in fairly destructive fashions when they are at loggerheads with each other. And I think what we need to be trying to work towards as the next phase goes forward is, people aren't necessarily going to agree on everything, but when they cooperate, they can get a lot more for each other than they can get by engaging in conflict. And I'm quite happy to move down that road, because at the end of the day, when they involve themselves in conflicts, it's not only bad for the regimes and the governments and the states and so on, it's much worse for the average human being. And I think that aspect of it sometimes gets left out.
Thank you, Hisham.
Thank you.
Sarah, it's 3 months, people are on the street.
Yes.
We're seeing a combination of youth, women, and dispersed protests. No leaders, but everybody is a leader somehow.
Yes. I think all the points that colleagues mentioned very much apply to the case of Iran. Political Islam failed, a dictatorship failed in Iran, an Islamic dictatorship has failed. There is a vacuum of ideology. There is the worsening of the conditions. You mentioned food bills and energy bills that have been on the rise globally, and of course for the countries across the region with smaller fiscal space, with lower income, higher energy bills and higher food bills means a decline in the household disposable income. It means inability to save. It means a more grimmer future prospect. It means loss of value of their savings because of the frequent currency devaluation cycles. And Iran has been a place that all of these issues have taken place. The Iranian system, socioeconomic system, has been very much affected and under the negative impact of bad management, bad governance, corruption, and economic sanctions. So it can't possibly get worse than this. You can't have any other external factor that makes the situation dire in a country. The population and the demographic changes very much also is similar to what Hisham mentioned about Egypt. Iranian female population today, about 42% of them are between the age of 15 and 39. Average protesters on the streets, and average age of the protesters, average age of those who have been arrested is 15. The female participation in the labor force between 1990s and today in Iran has fluctuated between 10 and 20%, which means only 1 in every 5 Iranian women had the opportunity to have an income, to have jobs. Iranian female labor participation is behind countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey. So you combine all of this and add to it the narrative of the state, which has been very much solidly since 2011, when the sanctions started to escalate on Iran. It has been formed around a populist / ideological narrative of we are in an economic jihad. We are standing to the global colonialist power of the West, and we want to stand for our values and we want to defend our values. But Iranian average women stand there and think, which values, what changes does it make to my ordinary day-to-day life? And that's exactly the vacuum of ideology that was mentioned. So you see, only about a month before the death of Mahsa Amini that led to the current protests, embezzlement case was surfaced in one of the largest state-owned steel manufacturing companies in Iran, in Isfahan, Foulad Mubarakeh, and $300 million were lost. Nobody knows where that money is. So when people think about Mahsa Amini's death as a black swan moment, nobody predicted it. No, it was in fact very much predictable. The uprising was very much predictable. It was only a matter of time. The clock was ticking, and it was very much a scenario that was likely to happen. So the conditions have worsened. The state have been very much entangled in maintaining its own power without delivering any answer to the questions that the nation has had, like many other countries across the region.
We'll come back to, we'll get in a bit more in terms of what the prospects are for Iran. But I want to come back to Tariq. You've heard what everybody's talked about. You wrote, or you co-authored a book on pathways for reform and renewal. What are the pathways out of the few years after that book came out?
Yeah. Well, thanks for giving me the easy question, how to fix the Arab world. I think the first thing I would note, just to pick up on something Hamza said. So people like me who have this deep normative commitment to democracy, we often tend to think that democracy is the answer. And when you get it, and you get the accountability and responsiveness that democracy entails, then the region's going to be able to achieve its potential. But then you look at a case like Tunisia. The Tunisian people voted for Qais Said, knowing full well that he was an anti-democrat. That was part of the appeal. If you look at survey data in the Arab world over the past several years conducted by the Arab Barometer, the places where citizens are least favorable towards democracy are the places that have the most democracy. It was Tunisia and Iraq. And so, and remember, just thinking now more globally, all of the world's established democracies are experiencing this crisis of legitimacy. So the first thing to recognize is that, even when sort of liberal or democratic participatory government is achieved, that's not necessarily the answer. That government has to deliver. In terms of how to get there, I guess this comes back to the point that I made earlier. These two competing movements, one to change leaders, which you see in some places, you don't see in others, but it's this simmering thing underneath, and the other, which is to change societies, which is this top-down, almost revolutionary impulse that we see in places like Saudi Arabia. You even see it in Egypt and elsewhere. And even though that top-down movement is associated with authoritarian regimes that I find morally reprehensible, the question is whether that lays the foundation for a medium or long-term move towards more participatory government that might actually be more successful than the upheavals were, right? So we might find that we'll get upheaval again, but upheaval in the absence of popular normative commitments to individual freedom, in the absence of political organization, that's just going to be upheaval. And the question is whether some of these movements to change the nature of the citizenry, the nature of the citizenry's relationship to religion, all of these things which, again, are coming out of regimes that one finds morally reprehensible, but still make a lot of sense. For example, when President Sisi talks about reforming the way that Muslims, Egyptian Muslims, understand their religion. Well, that is actually a very necessary thing, even though it comes out of the mouth of somebody who I'm not entirely sure understands what he's saying. And so the question is whether those reforms might set in motion an evolutionary path towards democracy that involves some economic development, that involves some normative change, that in the medium to long term might form a firmer foundation for the achievement of the goals that the Arab Spring erupted for.
We're going to come back to some of these ideas. Before I turn to Hisham and ask him, since you mentioned Egypt, I want to actually ask Hamza, you and I have talked about the politics of austerity that's coming as, the immediate need to deal with the crisis, the triple crisis we're seeing at a time when there is no fiscal space. What are the political implications of something like this?
Yeah, absolutely, Maha. I mean, the region, or many countries, especially the low and middle income countries in the region, I mean, Tunisia, Egypt, Lebanon, of course, and to lesser extent, of course, Jordan and Morocco are and will go through sort of austerity policies, simply because actually, I mean, this is a consequence of the shocks. I mean, the COVID, but also the slow recovery after the COVID and the war in Ukraine. The problem, or the major problem today, is that actually they cannot afford the status quo. Actually, they cannot really. It's impossible not to do anything simply because they risk a default and a financial crisis. But the other problem, what we are seeing is, especially in the case of Tunisia and Egypt, is that countries are today extremely focused on short-term fiscal measures, IMF programs or IMF deals, without really offering a sort of structural reforms and important reforms. It could be, in the case of Egypt, revising the whole role of the military in the economy, or in the case of Tunisia, revising, the rent-seeking position of many, groups, economic groups, business groups, opening up the economy, offering opportunities to unemployed, etc., or even widening and expanding the social protection. So it's clear that today, the austerity is a major challenge, and it comes in a context where, people, they don't really trust elections. So elections are not really the most favored sort of political expression venue in a way, or mode. But at the same time, there is a sort of, as I mentioned, polarization in the country and fragmentation of the protest movements. And protest, the whole protest landscape is getting really, really shaky, but really without really offering something, a serious alternative to these austerity measures. So it's like, this explains why maybe in Tunisia and Egypt, etc., there is a rise of security forces, military as well. It seems like, these regimes are not able to revise, rebuild the social coalitions, simply because, as you mentioned in your introductions, fiscal space is almost inexistent in both countries, and is really and seriously shrinking in other countries. So there is nothing to distribute. But how to be able to keep or to preserve a certain status quo, how to secure a minimum survival for these regimes. I think there is a trend now that is really going on in the region, which is really the rise and the rebuilding of the capacities of security, military, etc., which will be something that, I mean, very challenging, very expensive to sustain for countries who are really lacking financial resources. But that will be also challenged because simply we are witnessing leaderless movements, as was the case in 2011. But these movements are really, they keep alive the promise of change, the possibility of change. This is the case in Tunisia. Probably this will be the case in Egypt because I don't expect really sort of closure or, permanent closure of the political space or simply because the regime cannot really and is already starting a sort of opening. So this will be really a serious challenge. With the austerity I think there is this trend of the rise or rebuilding capacities of the security and military in the region. Yeah.
So we're looking at, unfortunately, more turbulence without obvious solutions. Hisham, let me turn to you. Egypt has been mentioned twice. We're talking about top-down change. President Sisi has been talking about a national dialogue. Is there anything on the horizon? What do you make of the prospects?
You know, we've been here for 2 days now, and the first time I hear thunder in the background is when this is happening right here. You know, this is not a good omen. خالص. A few things here. One, there were two things that I wanted to sort of react to. First was the ticking time bomb, and we should have all predicted, but also the hope and the expectation that there are things happening in the background by perhaps forces we're not particularly comfortable with, but hopefully something good will come out of it. I confess I'm very skeptical about this. And I'm skeptical because, to take the example of religion, for example, I think there are quite a few things that ought to be done in terms of religious education, in terms of how religious discourse operates, and so on and so on and so on. I think that's all very true. But I don't see that happening. I see instead this being part and parcel of power plays, power politics within different states, and fights happening very clearly. And you see this within like religious establishments, right? And I remember, just to pick up the example that you gave about religious reform, I remember seeing, I think it was Time or Newsweek, saying that Sisi was the Martin Luther of Islam or something. And I thought, okay, first, I don't know if you want him to be the Martin Luther of Islam, because there actually already was one, and his name was Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and I don't think you want that again, okay? But also, I don't think that that's what he saw himself doing either. So I think there's a lot of hope that we're putting out there. I frankly don't see it in that long-term sort of way at all, because I don't think that that's the point. Now, having said that, it's very true that in other places, it could very well be the case that as a result of a very forceful push from above, that there are intended and unintended consequences below, right? And of course, people bring up Singapore all the time as like the example for this, but the demographics are just very different. The processes and structures are just very different. So I didn't, that's not what Tariq was saying, but I don't think that that sort of model takes into account how many other things are sort of going on. And I do want to say one more thing about this ticking time bomb thing. I engage a lot with policymakers in places like Brussels and in DC and in London for my sins. And there was one very interesting statement that I heard recently from from someone connected to Brussels, someone who has been I shan't mention who, but somebody who's been very, very positive about engaging with countries in North Africa, even given all of the critiques about, backward slidings from democracy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the most, one of the strongest proponents of this, then telling all of his colleagues, by the way, we've been here before. 15 years ago, none of us thought that this could all kick off. No, it's going to kick off. We just don't know when. And it's not going to be pretty. Now, his rationale then was, because it's going to kick off and because it's going to be pretty, we need to do more to engage so that we can minimize and mitigate and so on. I mean, that's a debatable sort of policy point. But I think that sense of urgency has left the field. And this is what happens in policy circles, as you know, Maha, right? It's only when things are really urgent and striking, like literally at the time, that people start to take things quite seriously. But this is all very predictable. I mean, you have the energy crisis, you have the climate crisis, you have the demographic realities. As I said, the best of the best would have problems trying to manage this at the best of times, and this is not the best of times.
Fair enough. Ranish, let me turn to you. It's not the best of times, but you also mentioned, it's not the best of times. I don't know though if it's the worst of times. But you also mentioned the geopolitical context that Iraq is in the midst of. It has its own unique set of challenges. I don't know if we should open up a category for countries with power-sharing arrangements where Iran has considerable influence as well, and talk about the potential for change within these countries.
Well, look, I think I could have given the same answer Hamza gave, in fact, with his emphasis on fragmentation, because I think when there's fragmentation, particularly within the political landscape, and Iraq has undergone a lot of fragmentation, certain gaps open up for youth actors, civil society to organize, to capitalize on those gaps. And we saw that happen in Iraq recently when the protest movement on its electoral debut secured 10 seats. And that's despite coming up against some severe repression in the run-up to the elections. Secondly, fragmentation means the ruling elite can't consolidate their control, their hold on the political system, but also the state. However, on the flip side, there's a danger there because the stakes become considerably higher when you've got a fragmented elite. So Iraq may have, at some point in Baghdad, had 2 or 3 major armed factions. They've all splintered, and now that picture has turned into around 6 or 7 powerful armed factions or paramilitary forces, each engaged in very fierce rivalry, very resource-rich, battle-hardened, and so on and so forth. And the country actually came close to yet another civil war just a month ago. So if we're talking about ticking time bombs, Iraq is actually, unfortunately, due for another civil war in the foreseeable future. This is simply, the government formation process, the recent settlement, let's say, that was reached is only a temporary fix. However, again, this is where the glass half full perspective comes in. If there was to be a civil war in the country, if they can avoid, if the region can avoid getting involved in that civil war like they did after 2003, then that's a great thing. Casualties will be far less. The prospects of securing an end to the conflict will be much higher. And ultimately, more can be done when you don't have a multitude of actors involved in the conflict, as we've seen in Syria.
Can I ask you a question, though? I mean, this is more the kind of geopolitical context, but we've also seen a very fragmented protest movement. I mean, what's happening in Kurdish areas is almost divorced from what's happening in predominantly, I don't like these categories, but predominantly Shia areas or predominantly Sunni areas. And we've seen protests. I mean, it's the same kinds of discontent across the different communities, but yet they haven't been able to come together in any kind of clear manner.
I think that's a fair observation. Correct, not just fair. If you look at the protests in 2013 compared to 2018, there's a huge difference. The one in 2018 wasn't underscored by sectarianism or sectarian identity. The protest movement has actually done a remarkable job of reaching out to different segments. And that's only because they've got more experience, they've become a lot more resilient, and quite frankly, a lot more desperate, in fact. In terms of whether the different, let's say, patches of discontent in the country can actually amalgamate and come together, I'm quite skeptical, only because, you know, if in the Arab Sunni North, in quotation marks, the grievances are still somewhat different, but only because they're still recovering from the legacy of ISIS, from the brutality of the Maliki regime, for example, and they're quite tired, they're quite fatigued. And I think that's where perhaps I'm skeptical that there is a ticking time bomb in some parts of the region, because people are just too tired, too fatigued.
Exhausted.
They just want their livelihoods. But let me just say finally that I think the youth coming to Tariq's Pathways to Reform need to be a part of the solution. And in a place like Kurdistan, for example, not to say that it doesn't have its fair share of problems, they've embraced a digitalization agenda. And that means the days of a minister or an official keeping 50 or 100 people outside his office waiting just for a signature while he's finishing his lunch will soon be a thing of the past. So it's those small things, in fact, that can have a marked change on people's lives. Waiting for 5 hours to get a signature at a ministry or a government department is 5 hours they could be spending building a business. But of course, you know, for things like that, you also need to get rid of the red tape, the bureaucracy, and instill a culture of entrepreneurialism, essentially. That I think is where the focus needs to be moving forward.
See, the thunder gets louder. Sorry. Especially when it gets to Iraq. Lebanon is in the same boat, but I won't talk about that. Sarah, let me turn to you, and just if you can talk about where you see the protest movement going in Iran. Is it going anywhere, or will it continue at the same pace of discontent?
I think what we're likely to see is that people will match the regime's violence and political obtuseness with anger. And that has been going on for the past weeks. There are calls after calls for mass gatherings. There are days after days of strikes. There are letters after letters and statements after statements being issued inside and outside of Iran, asking for the government to end the violence, to call for a referendum that would be monitored by the international independent organizations to say yes or no to this regime, which the protesters seem to be confident that the majority will say no, therefore there could be a transition to change. But at the same time, there is a saying on Farsi Twitter that every time you refresh your feed on Twitter, there is a new name of a new person being killed in the protest by the regime. So for how long this can go on, which side has more stamina and more resilience, I think the regime perhaps and its violence is still at the moment in the more powerful position. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to change. As you mentioned, there is no obvious leader, and I think the protesters are very much mindful of not wanting to unite behind one single figure for the fear of repeat of the same mistakes of the Islamic Revolution in 1979.
Let me ask you this then on this note. There's no obvious figure from the experiences we've seen in other Arab countries, then the possibility of a military takeover, coup, becomes more evident, especially if they get to a point where they think that the mullah regime has become a liability. I mean, I'm asking whether is this...
Yes, but in debates these days about Iran, there are several scenarios. One is, Pakistan, Egypt, military takeover, business as usual, worsening of the situation. One is Venezuela, complete isolation, but dealing with like-minded states and surviving despite all the domestic dissidents. There is one scenario that is Tunisia before Qais Said. And there is one scenario which is Syria. But, which one is more likely? I think perhaps is the one that you mentioned, as sad as it sounds, or perhaps a Venezuela-like scenario. But yeah, unfortunately, that's the problem, and that is one of the fears that the protesters have, and that is why there is a very strong effort to highlight, especially outside of Iran, to campaign and highlight the involvement of IRGC in various forms of atrocity and violence against the people inside and outside of the country. You know, targeting dissidents, terrors, kidnapping dissidents outside of Iran, intimidation, online campaigns, arresting foreign citizens for pursuing various kinds of interests in negotiations with foreign states and so on and so forth. So there is an effort to put IRGC on the spotlight in the international community, to highlight that they are not the legitimate organization to take over. So hopefully that might help a little bit. But ultimately, in this sort of environment, the winner is sadly the person who holds the gun.
Okay, which is what we've seen, unfortunately, in other places. Well, we have a few minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you to perhaps, take 1 or 2 minutes to just quickly give us a glimmer of hope, if there is one, where you see things going, and is there a potential for maybe not in the next 5 years, but maybe in the next 10 years? We have to have a longer timeline. Tariq, I'm going to start with you despite the perplexed look.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. We have to recognize that in this part of the world, there are some major structural obstacles to democracy. So one place that, seems very hopeful if you look at it, I mean, hopeful in comparative terms, a place like Sudan, where, there is still to this moment a kind of tussling between civilian forces and the military over the future of that country. You can't count the Democrats out of that. And yet, in Sudan, if you just make a bet based on the socioeconomic conditions of that country, the bet would have to be that this is not going to be a country that can achieve democracy. If we look at countries like Iraq or Lebanon, the structural obstacle there is this incredible sectarian divide. And so that really does suggest a kind of limit to what can be achieved. You have poverty in many countries. You have overweening militaries. And then on top of that, you have an international environment that is not conducive to democracy. You have international actors that we've only alluded to that are not open to the idea of more representative government. So that's all the reasons for us to be pessimistic. I would say if there would be a reason for us to become optimistic, it would be that Western governments start using their influence in the region to nudge them towards more respect for human rights, more political participation that, again, over the long term could result in something real.
Thank you, Tariq. Hisham, I'm going to mix it up a little bit.
Hope in like 1 minute. Okay. If you don't mind, Maha, I will answer half in that way, and the other half is, I'm just very interested to see how things develop. We skirted around the issue of religion. I think actually it's a very interesting discussion to follow in the region, because there are also tussling forces in ways that we don't always recognize, because different governments are trying to promote certain versions of how religion in the public arena should actually look. And that I find very interesting. And we've seen that from Saudi, from the UAE, even from other countries in the region. In terms of how that develops, I find that interesting. And I think that's something to watch. In terms of hope, I look at this in a much longer sort of framework, if I may. As I said, the average age in these countries is dropping and dropping tremendously. Okay, and they're not like their parents and their grandparents. They are going to want to see far more accountability. They may not want to see necessarily, strong political parties and things like that, because they've never experienced that political culture. But they are going to want to see ways in which to improve the lot of their own lives, as well as those around them. Okay. And I think the only good can eventually come out of that. My concern is what happens in the meantime, and in between, what sort of things we need to be prepared for and mitigated. That thunder was not from me, by the way.
Okay.
That was Tariq.
All right. Let me turn to you, Ranj.
Well, I would say not necessarily glimmers of hope, but I would say there'll be patches of success in the region. But to be quite frank, I think that the worst is still yet to come. I'm going to put my conflict hat on here and say that Syria will most likely see conflict relapse in the 10-year time frame that you stipulated.
5 year.
5 years, sorry, 5 year, right. Okay, well, it's more hopeful than on that front. There are still a number of issues away from the glare of the media, like potential ISIS resurgence, like the future of internally displaced people in Iraq and Syria. That's a ticking time bomb, if anything, with the issue of foreign fighters, ISIS prisoners still unresolved, and an entire generation growing up in those camps ready to seek revenge, essentially. So that's a ticking time bomb. Third, I would say this is the glimmer of hope part. The region itself, I think, is starting to come together to look at how to engage in de-escalation outside of the conventional, traditional US framework, or Western framework, rather. And I think that's something where there needs to be greater investment and attention, because the gains that might have been made over the past couple of years can be lost very quickly. It can take very long to make those gains, to make progress in establishing a security architecture in the region. But all it takes is one dispute, one tension, one escalation for that to be completely demolished.
Thank you, Ranj. We're really trying to find the glimmer here. Hamza, it's over to you. Come back to your glimmer of hope of earlier.
Yeah. But actually, I think despite, all the setbacks, challenges, etc., I think what the Arab world and, experienced over this decade is a sort of maybe, de-romanticization of democracy in a way, or getting really into the hard realities, actually. This is something really extremely important. For decades, people in the region, they lived with Islam is the solution. I don't know, the leader is the solution. We are in a region where even strong men, they ended up failing, actually. This is, strong men in many other regions, they are seen, or they have been used to be seen as really the solution to. But we see today that Sisi is failing, and other dictators and other regimes, many regimes are failing in the region. So this is something really interesting that I think elites and people accumulated a lot of experience in this. And despite all the shortcomings or even the failures or the challenges, I think there are no easy, they know that there are no simple or easy answers to very complex questions. And I think the structural, as Tariq mentioned, the region is facing structural problems. It needs very comprehensive answers, or to be addressed comprehensively. The other thing is that the issue of economic reform is a highly political question. And I think it's about redistribution. It's about redistribution of power and wealth. And people are touching up on some serious challenges, actually, that maybe were overlooked over the previous decades, but they are coming to this conclusion now.
So the hard work has to begin now.
Yeah, definitely.
Sarah, last but not least.
Thank you. So I first to start with thanking you and the panelists and ISPI, something I forgot to do at the beginning of my presentation. I really enjoyed the discussion, really appreciate the opportunity. Second, I would like to highlight two glimmers of hope. One is specifically in regards with Iran, human rights situation and violation of human rights have always been a fringe of other negotiations with the states at international level. So human rights violations been used as brownie points to win negotiation in other areas. And now it seems like human rights is becoming at the heart of the conversation with the EU, with the UN special session, with the conversations to kick out Iran from the Commission of Women at the UN level, and so on and so forth. So this is a glimmer of hope, at least for me, that the human and the people of Iran are not being forgotten in every negotiation with the states. This is one glimmer. The second one is that people of my generation, and I'm not really that old, I'm only 25 plus a couple of decades, right? So we grow up in Iran with the these cassettes with the audiobooks. We had to listen to it once and then rewind it, wait for it to go to the beginning and listen to it one more time. The current generations that are on the streets, they can start a story on TikTok every 30 seconds. So they have different aspirations, they have different attention span, they have different desires, and they have different ways of wanting to demand change and reform and hold people accountable. Of course, this is all held at the mercy of the states, and there is structural issues. The reform is extremely political. There is political oppression, there is violence, and so on and so forth. But still, it's a glimmer of hope. Thank you.
I want to please ask you to join me in thanking our panelists. I would not even try and summarize what was being said, but thank you very much for a very interesting conversation. I think we can continue this conversation into, unfortunately, we'll be doing this for many more years to come. But
Thank you, Ma.
Thank you, Mark.
pleasure.